This seems a little loud to me personally. No, it's not. Okay, it's just me hitting me. Everybody online okay before we start a meditation or continue meditation? Okay. Um, so tonight we're, oh, good idea. Thanks for the reminders to turn phones off. Yeah. Thanks. Tonight we're going to be talking about, and I'll go into what the sutta is called and why that may or may not really serve us. But we're going to be talking about hatred and goodness. And I want something I've been sort of an edge in my own meditation practice and my own psychospiritual work, is assuming adequacy, assuming um, assuming capacity, instead of assuming, like I've caught myself at times kind of a little hunched and bracing for life. Um, I had a moment I shared with my meditation community, or our community recently, about a moment between the cushion and the door where I felt my body kind of collapsing a little bit, and I felt myself assuming that I was inadequate to what I was headed out into. And in that moment, before I could really even think in these terms, I felt myself straighten up and breathe into myself and to open and to assume something different, or to recognize that story as a story and recognize that I could lean into a different understanding of my own capacity. And so I'm going to ask you, going into this practice, do this soundtrack. I'm going to ask you to assume that whatever comes up in your practice, um, that you are able to meet it, that it's not going to bowl you over, that in this life you have been through more waves of emotions and thoughts and fantasies, and sometimes you thought they were going to wreck and destroy you, and sometimes you thought you had discovered the best idea that had ever been thought by any mind, and then life just kept going, and you've been through all of them. I mean, just thousands upon millions upon billions of thoughts and emotions and moments of different ways of experiencing. And so you've made it through all of those to the point where you got here. So I say this because there will be a point where I will ask you to turn toward something difficult and to feel into that and feel the shape of it. And I want you to assume that you can do that and that it's not going to bowl you over. Any questions, thoughts, concerns before we start? And find a way of positioning your body that feels sustainable for the next 20, 25 minutes, probably. And yeah, let that be sufficient. And then I'll carry you through practice as best I can. And remember, yeah, the only thing I would want to add to what I said earlier is that pain doesn't need punishment. Um, that pain is asking for awareness and compassion, that punishment, I've never seen punishment solve the problem of pain, right? So when, whatever hindrances come up, whatever stress there may be, assuming adequacy, assuming capacity, and meeting it with, um, remembering the boundless nature of the heart and knowing there is enough compassion and kindness to go around. I'm going to ring the bell one more time, and I want you to let the sound of the bell as it fades carry you down into stillness and quiet. So beginning feeling an upright spine that conveys a sense of mobility. And this is really where confidence in the practice begins, is simply the way we hold the body. Whether walking, seated, lying down, it is possible to experience one's posture as noble and awake, energized and alert. And so that that doesn't get too rigid or intense or high strung, we balance it with a remembrance of the natural, of the softening of the muscles at the jaw and the temples, the shoulders, the belly. And so, what's it like to play at the intersection of uprightness and ease, of nobility and naturalness? This is kind of a shorthand for right effort or finely tuned media energy, right? And letting that energy be in part directed toward present moment awareness, recognizing the mind's habit to move into past and future and fantasy and saying, not right now. Right now, I recognize that the present moment is my laboratory. This is where the work of the path can be done. And infusing that intention to be present with a sense of kindness so that it doesn't become a tough love chore, but instead an energy and effort infused with warmth, and dynamic, wise love. Noble and natural, present and kind. And imagine that those four qualities stitch themselves into your breath, breathing in noble, breathing out natural, breathing in present, breathing out kind. And then let the thoughts and the words go and just assume that they're in the breath and that they're flowing in and through the body. Find your rhythm. Feel into this expanding and contracting, rising and falling, breathing body. And let the mind that is so used to running amok all through the day, let it finally come and rest. Rest, but remain alert here on the rhythm of the breath. The breath infused by love and awakeness, energy and clarity, flowing in and out of the nostrils, heart, through the belly. And just find somewhere that it's easy to rest with the breath and spend some time there. If the mind wanders, gets caught in thoughts and fantasies, plans and memories, just gently notice that it's wandered and call it back. And when you do that, rather than engaging in any sort of recrimination or punishment, think about celebrating an opportunity to practice sati, an opportunity to practice remembering to come back to the practice of Dhamma. And every time you do that, every time you remember to come home, that's training in the seventh fold of the Eightfold Path. And if the mind is able to really rest continuously on the rhythm of the breathing body, then wonderful. That's the eighth fold of the Eightfold Path, samadhi. So let it be a win-win. Either I remember to come back again and again. I get to come home and celebrate coming home again and again. Or I'm able to keep the mind still and consistent. Something to celebrate and be glad about either way. And as your mind begins to settle to whatever degree, start to see if you can expand your awareness to feel the breath and the sense of loving kindness carried by the breath move throughout parts of the body that previously you weren't as aware of. Perhaps feeling the breath flow through the shoulders, down into the arms and into the hands and fingers. Feeling the breath flow through the head, even into its center. Feel the way that even the hips and the pelvic bowl rises and falls, opens and closes with the breath, and how it might flow down into the legs, into the feet and toes. Just let awareness open gently. Stay in contact with a loving breath moving through the breathing body. And if that makes you smile at all, great. Meditation doesn't have to be a hyper serious business. It's okay to smile with gladness and gratitude to a loving body or a body full of a loving breath. And see if again you can let things become still and settle without losing the clarity and the alertness and the ardency of an awake mind. We're finding subtler and subtler interactions between relaxation and alertness and awakeness. And I want you to hold yourselves capable, confident, and courageous, all the C's. And I want you to bring to mind a being who brings up for you something approaching a sense of hatred. And please don't engage in bypass. Oh, I don't hate anybody. I don't feel anger. I don't have any resentments. Set that aside. There's no judgment here, and you won't be asked to account for any of this, but just call someone to mind, knowing that you're in choice here. You're calling their image to mind. Whether you call it hatred or not isn't important. If there's frustration, resentment, anger, ill will, rage, allow that being to come up, and you can put them at however safe a distance you want. That's fine. It's not requiring boundary crossing. You can put them in a big glass box if you want. But I want you to feel into what it's like in your body, to feel what it's like to hold hatred, ill will, resentment, frustration, rage, anger. And I want you, as much as you can, to set aside whatever part of your mind might want to avoid by debating the language. We can do that, but not right now. What happens in your heart center? What happens in your belly? What happens to your shoulders and your jaw when this being comes to mind? Can you be honest with yourself about the pain of hatred? This is not moralizing. It's not a good or bad. It's just, can you feel into the discomfort of that? Perhaps for you, there's a tightness, or maybe a heat or a contraction, a burning, a desire to get away, a heaviness, a frantic sort of vibration. Don't go into story, just feel. Feel what it's like to breathe into that now. And then I want you to let them go. Let that image of them go farther and farther away and become smaller and smaller. And I want you to imagine instead, right before you, a being who is very easy for you to love. This can be an animal or a teacher or a friend or a tree, or it could even just be a place. If it's just a place that you go and see if you can, breathe through that, whatever that sensation was, just softening again, being in the presence of this lovable being and being who loves you. And maybe there's even a sense of, oh, thank God they're gone. So good to be with you. And feel what it's like to breathe now. What it's like to be in the presence of love. And maybe most particularly the relief where there was a certain kind of pain. The relief that might, be the felt experience of something like, oh, or maybe even imagine having your hands held, or if it's an animal, having them lie in your lap, or maybe you breathe, or maybe somebody puts their head on your shoulder, or vice versa. And then again into this breathing, loving body. And smooth, continuous breath. And as we close, express gratitude for the presence of the body, gratitude for the breath flowing in and out, teaching us the truths of impermanence and teaching us how to balance our own energy. Gratitude for the loving heart, gratitude to the being who helped us find a sense of love and care, gratitude to the being who held a mirror to what it's like to hold hatred in the body. Gratitude to the other dozen or so people in the Sangha tonight who have gathered to practice together so that we don't have to do this work alone. The sound of the bell echoes the truth of impermanence. So don't abandon yourself. Don't abandon the mind. Don't abandon the heart. Don't abandon the work you just did by opening your eyes and moving and reorienting. Uh, feel into a sense of continuity. The image that comes to mind right now is imagine you were in a canoe and you moved from a river, freshwater current into the ocean, still on water, still in the canoe, still doing the work, but the landscape has changed a little bit now and you have to contend differently. I'd like to open briefly before going into before going into our sutta, just to ask, are there any questions, reflections, remembering that this is not to push anybody, but remembering that it is an act of generosity to speak from your experience.
We lost something on here where we can't see it to people anymore.
Yeah, that's the same on mine. I'm not sure.
Okay, maybe change it to gallery.
Oh, Dana, yes.
Just appreciation for the somatic. Yeah, just in the experience of the being that we felt hatred towards, just the somatic experience of noticing that anger, when I get still with my anger, to see that there's sadness underneath it and to really feel that.
So for those of you online, there was nodding on both sides of Dana as she said that. So something about the stillness, the presence with anger, and that awareness allowed you to see something beneath or behind the anger. Okay. and specifically sadness here.
Sadness.
Yeah. Nothing like being vulnerable and speaking into a microphone, right? How many of us are there actually? So 1, 2, 3, and then everybody else is present here. So 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, so 11. Okay. Anybody else find anything that either surprised them or um, yeah, aroused interest or anything that was confusing or that you felt yourself kind of blocked or bracing for? Um, Anybody have trouble feeling into the somatic experience? By somatic here, just talking about the physical sensations, um, the sense of being in a physical body vis-a-vis whatever the experience was. Valerie's got something.
Thank you. At first I picked somebody who was a political figure, and it was very difficult for me to stay present in my body with that because I had like such kind of intense anger that I just would check out really quickly. So then I changed and picked somebody that was personal to me, and that I was able to stay with that better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it's always tricky business, because depending on our history, our mind's tendency to dissociate when it reaches a certain threshold. And that is part of why I wanted to prime the group with the assumption of capacity. The assumption of capability or capacity, right? So the tendency to eject the mind from the body that we talk about as dissociation. There's a nuanced conversation to be had here, but much of the time, especially if we carry stories about our own incapacity, about what I can and can't handle, and if that gets more and more immersed in a story of fragility, then earlier and earlier on we eject, right? We say, well, this is uncomfortable, right? Or we were talking, it was actually before you got here, the sense of like, this feels dangerous, gotta go, right? And so honoring what our actual capacity is in a new particular moment, and also testing the threshold, right? Of like, is there a story here that says I can't handle this? And then how real is it? Do I need to make adjustments? Can I push a little bit? And then when I push to a certain point, go, okay, did it. That's my exercise for the day. That was me adding another, what do you call the things on the sides of the bars that make the dumbbells? Yeah, whatever the weight circle is that you add to it. Like that was my extra 5 pounds for today and all done. So thank you for bringing that dynamic in. Yes.
Is it on?
It is.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
How about now? Can you hear me? Okay. I was just thinking about what you said at the end, how we shifted toward the being that we felt was easy to love. And in my mind, that was it was very comforting. And it makes me think as you're talking about this, when we're like pushing that edge of capacity, what is it like to also think like, or for me, like, can I find more capacity if either I have other people in my life who are supporting me, whether it's like in my own heart and mind, or even just asking for their presence of like, I need to do this thing and this is really hard. And will you do it alongside me to kind of grow that capacity with community?
Yep. And yeah, I think so important, so valuable. I'm personally not much for the kind of Visuddhimagga style of metta, the sort of categories of beings in this very sort of almost like ritualized way. Just, easy, neutral, difficult. The one thing I do like about it is that, and this isn't how it's taught generally, but the one thing I really like about it is that if you cultivate, if you begin with something, you're starting very close in and bringing around people who it is easy to love and by whom it is easy to see yourself as being loved, and you keep them. And this is where I think there's a real sort of individualism versus village mindedness in the practice. Like, do I have to go it alone with all these individuals in these categories? Or do I start by calling in maybe one, maybe 10, maybe 15 people that it's really easy to love and feel them around me and keep them as I go through people that is very difficult to love? Because I do find that it is much easier for me to be face to face with somebody who is very maybe scary for me or brings up a lot of resentment, if I feel surrounded by and held by a community of love, right? And I think one of the dangers and dangers, maybe I'll say this instead. The Theravada Buddhist tradition, which is where I mostly locate myself, is largely a monastic ascetic tradition where there is a lot of emphasis in certain contexts on aloneness, on sort of aloofness or separation. And yet, and like that's the story that gets emphasized a lot. And yet, Sangha is one of the, not only is one of the refuges or gems, which literally just means to gather together, right? But the Buddha said that the monastic community wasn't supposed to be more than 7 stones throw away from a village. And there are all these lovely little suttas where you look, these 3 monks, they're living together. And the Buddha goes and asks, like, well, how are you all getting along? And they say, oh, like milk and water, just blending perfectly. And he says, how are you doing that, right? And they talk about sort of like, well, I think about what I want to do. And then I think, well, okay, if I do that or not, but I'm going to think, what does this venerable one want to do, right? So there's all these like wonderful little loving celebrations of what it is to be in community, to be together, and to feel the courage and the strength of the community and the safety and the refuge that comes with community. And not only that, but every year the Rains Retreat was a gathering. Like, so however alone people were for 9 months out of the year, they often gathered in a place together for 3 months and practiced deeply together, right? So there was always touching into community and the refuge of community and the safety of togetherness. And so I think it behooves us, especially because in the West, we tend so quickly and so the story is so immediately hijacked by individualism and exceptionalism and aloneness. I find this especially true for men, but not entirely, or those conditioned male, masculine, that it is really a story that it makes sense to consciously bring in to say, can I gather a village around me? Can I call ancestral lineage? Can I call spiritual lineage? Can I call the beings of this place? Can I call an invisible help to gather around me so I don't feel like I'm doing this by myself? Because I personally find, so when we talk about where hatred comes from, for me, protective anger is like #1 defense strategy, right? And won't go into all the ways that was rewarded or how that was normalized and also shamed and how that moves in a vicious cycle. But I know that for me, my anger, my hatred, and my judgment, and like there's all kinds of mechanisms there, are tied very much to how helpless I feel in the face of whatever I'm facing, in the face of whatever I see myself as the victim of a lot of the time. And I know that I'm less likely to spin that story if I feel supported and carried. Right. Everything okay? I see something in the chat. I just want to check on this real quick. Oh, it's you. Okay, never mind.
There's a.
Looks like Sharon, wanted to say something.
Before we started that meditation, you had, it's the first time I've kind of really heard it put this way, which is one of the reasons I wanted to do this with you, because you've brought a few things to me that I have not kind of it jived with, that it really fell for me, fell into me. And talking about capacity and maybe moving into it a little bit more. And I know one of the things in my life, and I feel that it's been such a tremendous gift, is having community, having a village, yet as a child, not. And the village was the Marine Corps, that as a child. There was a lot going for that, and not so much. And then when I got a little older, I actually spent 10 years in a community. And I know that one of the things that comes to me a lot is this place of calling, of really having a great sense of knowing about my capacity, and that I have been through a lot, and not just because of my age, but lucky enough to have been through a lot, and also I think touched enough to be able to kind of step back and go, this too shall pass. Whether that's a disengagement and a survival skill, I'm not quite sure. Might very well be both. And also looking back at history and knowing that certainly right now we're in a flashpoint and a pretty historical situation. And I know some of my own frustration comes into play where I get quite angry. And that is both sadness and great frustration, and trying to figure out where do I help? How can I heal this for all of us, for any of us, for myself, for anybody else. And
Mind if before you finish, just because you said two important things, I just want to
yeah,
real quick, is that okay?
yes.
Okay.
My dog's being picked up right now.
Oh,
it's okay.
Actually, the first was I wanted to clarify something at the beginning of what you said. Were you saying you felt drawn because I was saying things in a way that didn't quite settle, or that there were things that didn't quite settle before that somehow I framed that fell into place a little more easily?
Fell into place.
Great, just wanted to clarify that. Yeah, the other, so I think for a lot of us, we wonder at times, another one of the Visuddhimagga sort of categorizations I sometimes like is looking at the four boundless heart trainings, right? So loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, and their near enemies and their far enemies, right? So, and the near enemies are the things that feel like them, that it's easy to confuse them with, but aren't actually them, right? And there's a lot of variations on this that go around, but wondering sometimes, oh, can I trust this equanimity? Is this equanimity, or is this a kind of dissociated state, right? Is this a disconnection? Is this a refusal to participate? And what I would say there is, rather than, because for many of us, I include myself in this category historically for quite a while, we'll sort of surrender to that confusion. We go like, well, guess there's no way of knowing. And sometimes that may be true, like we don't need to like force it, but I do think that actually asking yourself and trusting a sort of intuition, am I still an engaged witness with what we're talking about here, or am I not, right? I think that's like on its own, it's like, because if the near enemy, we'll say, is something along the lines of, I don't like using the word apathy because it's actually been bastardized so much, but a disengagement, a separation, a not caring, a lack of empathy, right? A lack of intimacy, right, with that thing. And we know, if we're being honest with ourselves, we know am I refusing a relationship, or am I in relationship and coming at it in a balanced way, right? We intuitively do know the difference between the warmth. Well, it's actually funny that I say that, because a lot of the metaphors for equanimity are coolness, like the moon, light of the moon. But there is a warmth in that I'm staying connected. I'm just not getting swept into craving or aversion, despair or hope. I'm just balanced and I'm in relationship, which is very different from saying, I want nothing to do with this. And so because I'm checked out, I don't feel much of anything, right? So I would just say, like, trust yourself to explore that. If you say, this too shall pass, and you're not, again, upekkha literally means to witness, it means to look upon. And so if you're willing to look upon it and there's a balancedness of heart, trust that. If on the other hand, you're saying, this too shall pass, I'm done, I'm checked out, it's more of a spiritual bypass thing, like, you'll know that. Like, I would say, trust yourself to know the difference between those two things. Sorry, did you want to finish though before I go on anymore?
Well, I like actually what you just said about, you know, being in equanimity, and there's almost a difference between being engaged in equanimity, which is like you said, cool, disengaging place to be equanimous. But I don't think that that's necessarily true, which is what you're saying. It is a way of being engaged to hold both things to be true.
Which to hold both things in this context being
Anger, sadness,
oh,
hope, uh, in any of the kind of opposites, aggression, pulling back, love, hate.
yeah. I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh translates the fourth Brahma Vihara as inclusion, which I thought was pretty radical. And I was like, what are you talking about when I first heard that? So, but I mean, I think it's pointing at part of what you're saying, that intuition that equanimity can remain balanced while including all of it. And I think the reason I brought in the warmth piece was that, yes, equanimity is cool in the sense that it's not letting itself sort of get moved by the friction, but it's warm in the sense that that equanimity is not separate from the other three Brahma Viharas, right? The warmth of metta is what keeps, I mean, and Michelle McDonald, who's a teacher that my partner and I like very much, speaks a lot about the Brahma Viharas. She'll say that metta is what keeps upekkha from drifting off into its near enemy, and that upekkha is what keeps metta, is what anchors metta from drifting off into its near enemy, right? As a kind of, you can interpret it as a kind of a lusty sort of passion desire, or even a kind of like saccharine niceness, like almost a sycophancy. They're both near enemies, right? And one of the problems I think with having the word love in English be so catch-all, there's a lot of, in Greek, in Pali, in other languages around the world, there are a lot of different words for love. And we just have this one very blunt instrument, which I'm trying to rescue. I'm trying really hard, but it's a challenge. So.
Well, I think this thing that this equanimity and this idea of it actually is about inclusion, or as you initially talked about, witnessing. And I've been really, which is very inclusive. And just yesterday in one of my sanghas, we were talking about that witnessing does not mean not talking. It doesn't mean quietness. It doesn't even necessarily mean serenity. Because one of the things I've been lucky enough to do, for 10 years, I worked with people that were dying. And there was a lot of witnessing going on. And the witnessing often is just about holding a place for people to show up without being, without pushing them away. And you would actually have to be quite equanimous in being able to include them in conversations, in ways of taking care of someone that they love and not
You've
push
done a lot of your
away.
own work. Yeah,
Yeah.
you've done a lot of your own work to not superimpose
Well,
stuff on them or push and pull on them, right?
yeah. And that witnessing is a lot of work. It's not, I mean, it could seem quiet, but it can be a lot of work
Yep.
to be able to do that.
Yep.
And
Right.
I think it's informed my meditation and my understanding of Buddhism certainly as a lifelong way to. I think I've been able to tap my toe in a little more easily into Buddhism.
Yeah, I mean, well, the Buddha, just because of the work you've done, it's worth noting that the Buddha didn't, as far as contemplations and mind training, there is overlap between the monastic and the lay community, but in some areas, not a lot. And one of the lists that he said should be contemplated daily by the lay and monastic community are the 5 subjects of frequent recollection, right? The recollection of aging, illness, and death, separation, and karma, right? The nature that we are the owners and heirs of our actions and the consequences. And so there is, I mean, the Buddha placed a very high premium on the power of the contemplation of death and being in the presence of death and decay and what that could clarify and lead us toward in our practice. So you were doing the work, whether you were meaning to do it or not, for a long time. So thank you for saying all that. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
One of the things that, it can, like Valerie's, really importantly brought up this issue that often, sort of catches my attention because, depending on the circle, it's like, do we lead people toward mind states that are challenging and painful intentionally when there's already so much pain? It's enough pain to go around, right? And I think yes. I think yes, in large part because if we do not understand, I mean, like, think about the task of the first noble truth, because one of my teachers, non-Buddhist teachers, very openly non-Buddhist teachers, will say, essentially, everybody will go around saying, oh yeah, well, of course I'm going to die. We're all going to die, right? And how many people do you know that are living like it's true, right? That are actually walking around like they know it in their bones. And I think similarly, we're like, yeah, of course there's pain, there's discomfort, there's stress in life. And yet the Buddha is telling us that our task with regard to dukkha is to understand it. So the implication there is that we are missing something, or missing many things, or missing the depth or the subtlety or the ubiquity of it, right? And so until we see clearly how much something hurts, we will not be sufficiently motivated to seek relief from it. And so calling in hatred, right, and refusing to bypass it, refusing to play word games, again, it doesn't matter where you found yourself along the spectrum. And I've been in debates in classrooms where we argue whether anger and hatred are even on the same spectrum or whether it's a qualitatively different phenomenon. It doesn't matter, I think, on some level for this purpose, because what we're talking about here is, can we get in touch with the burden and the pain and the stress of experiencing hatred or something like it? Yes.
What you're saying is raising up something for me around the value of somatic practice.
Yes.
And
I just want to say,
I know James also has his hand up, so James, we'll get to you in a moment.
I'm sorry. After these two, I'll dive into the sutta because
yeah, so I'm a somatic coach, and I'm thinking about when I'm doing somatic practices with someone, I'm thinking about for the sake of what, right? For the sake of what are we doing this? We're with meditation, we're always thinking about what are we training for? What are we trying to build the capacity for? And with equanimity, I think about this concept in somatics around containment. We're working to be able to hold more, to feel more. And it reminds me, in connection to what you're saying, of a teacher of mine talked about true equanimity is it's knowing the difference between non-attachment and detachment.
Yeah.
And in non-attachment, there's a holding of the caring.
Have you ever seen the hand motions for this?
I don't think so.
So attachment, detachment, non-attachment. Have you ever?
Oh, no.
Yeah. That stuck with me 15 years ago when I first saw it. I was like, oh, it's a nice illustration. Just like to be connected. It does, because non-attachment doesn't necessarily mean disconnected, right?
Right.
But it doesn't also mean entangled or confused, you know.
Yeah. And if we can't hold it, then we can't include it. So that's what we're training for
Or at least
by
hold
being with
space
it.
for it.
Hold
Right.
space for it
Yeah.
with a caring for it. Because with detachment, we have to maintain the caring with the witnessing.
Mm.
And that's the difference. And when we do that practice, when you led that through us practice, you're allowing us to train for the holding.
Mm.
That allows us not to be aversive or grasping what feels good. Yeah.
So kind of, controlled exposure therapy. In some ways, like,
Yeah.
how do we build a sufficiently safe, environment, a sense of refuge, so that we can invite in this thing that feels like too much, and then also, titrate. Were you saying, sorry, just to be clear though, were you saying detachment, non-attachment, like detachment was the ideal state? Or no, I didn't think so, but then no, I know, but I did that. I wanted to make sure. I realized, like, oh, I could have just been superimposing my language onto you. Okay. Good.
Non-attachment is the neutrality that maintains the containment and the caring.
Yes. Okay. I misheard that. Thank you. James, and then I'll finally. My partner often will tell me, she's like, I like the conversational thing. Yeah, but you can also just balance, and then you can just go into just do the thing, do the teaching thing. It's like, okay, fine, but I like hearing everybody else's thoughts. I know my thoughts.
Yeah, you mentioned spiritual bypassing, and the first time I heard it was just maybe a year ago. I'm a member of a book group and we were studying Tasanki Rinpoche and Daniel Goleman's Why We Meditate, and they mentioned it. And that's the first time I really heard it, and I'm like, I can see where that's a real problem when I read about it, but it's really subtle. I mean, it's easy to fall into that trap for me.
I will say,
because it's easy not to think about it.
It can be subtle. It can also be very blatant at times. But yes,
Yeah,
because you're sincere, it's subtle.
right. So I was wondering, maybe if you could just speak to it in the context of meditation, because it's easy to say, well, I should be feeling this good. I should be feeling blissful. I should be feeling good in meditation. And when we have these emotions, well, I shouldn't be feeling that. So it's easy to kind of bypass that.
Yeah, and I mean, first, thank you, by the way. But the first tool I would just say on what you just said, noting judgment as judgment, right? So like as soon as there's the impulse to categorize and judge and manage in that way, it's like noting that that's what's arising, right? But yeah, for spiritual bypass, I know that people have different ways of talking about it. There are a couple different ways, or a couple different overlapping kind of circles from the Venn diagram. One has to do with claiming wisdom that you have not earned, right? So, you hear a teaching on something, or you read a book, or you read a sutta, and it's not that the thing isn't true, it's that it's not true for you yet. You haven't actually seen it all the way down. And so are you being fundamentally spiritual bypass, or the refusal to bypass spiritual engagement, spiritual intimacy, spiritual contact, relationship? It's about honesty, right? Am I being honest about what's happening in my experience right now? Or am I allowing the should to hijack my perception, right? So if I think I shouldn't be feeling X, Y, or Z way, am I not allowing myself to acknowledge that I'm feeling X, Y, or Z way, right? So, and to some degree, I think spiritual bypass is important to bring up because it is a succinct way of talking about the opposite direction of the First Noble Truth, right? It's the refusal to engage in the task of understanding the nature of dukkha, because we're not acknowledging dukkha. We're trying to use a borrowed wisdom or something and it gets tricky, because this is where I think fake it till you make it becomes really problematic, right? Because if fake it means reject the reality of this moment and pretend to be somewhere I'm not, then we're actually not allowing ourselves to learn from our present moment experience. And so, yeah, I mean, spiritual bypass is anti-presence. It's the opposite also, or the complement to distress tolerance, which I think is actually the fundamental, like the missing discipline of America, is distress tolerance, because distress tolerance is the willingness to be uncomfortable for the sake of something greater, right? And so like consumerism, capitalism, these things are all very much tangled up with the obsession with comfort and the addiction to comfort. And so spiritual bypass is a natural byproduct of being in a both individualistically exhausting and also capitalistic productivity-based consumerist environment. And so this idea of the customer is always right, getting translated into our mental experience. If something unpleasant is here, or if they don't have what I want, I should be able to order what I want right now and get it, right? And instead, be like, oh, this is what's being offered to me. This is what's coming forth from the body. This is what's coming forth from the mind. This is the gift of the Dhamma in this moment. What is it trying to teach me? And we're going to get to the metaphor in this sutta that is about humbling ourselves. And as my partner was teaching me when I was asking her, I was like, what do you think about this metaphor? You know, like what it is to accept something so radically on its own terms that I'm willing to get down on my hands and knees in the mud and drink water out of a cow's footprint. Like that level of humility, and to do that with the goodness in others in the midst of a sea of expletives are coming to mind right now. So I'm a sea of yuckiness. When there's a sea of yuckiness, can we select for the nourishment without ignoring or pretending like the yuckiness isn't there, right? And it's the pretending that's the issue, not the focusing on goodness. Does this make sense? Am I speaking to?
Oh yeah, very helpful.
Okay, cool.
So would you say that we have an opportunity now not to waste our suffering by practicing non-preference? Like I do when I go to the cafeteria and say, oh, I'm gonna take the thing that, you know what I'm saying?
Well, try to, so sorry, it would be a waste to practice non-preference because.
No, I'm saying like, I'm taking what you're saying and always we try to apply it to our lives and what we're going through, right?
Mhm.
So my mind is drawing this conclusion of like, you know, many of us are suffering right now, extra. And so is part of my way of having right thinking to say, do non-preference practice here and be with what's being offered and not waste the suffering in that way by making it part of my practice in that way, like I do when I try to go and say, I'm going to take the thing that I don't want as much when I go to the restaurant to practice what it's like to be with what it has to offer.
Yeah, I would say, so the question for everybody online is about how much do I practice and sort of consciously cultivate non-preferential attitudes out in the world, I think, and whether it's, you know, kind of the waste part, would you say that again?
Yeah, I'm not really in question about how much do I
Oh,
do it.
okay.
I'm asking, is that a way to
Maybe we just keep the mic right here.
It's more like I'm asking, is that maybe a helpful way to think about it?
Oh, yes. I think what I lean into often, there's a kind of a Pure Land practice where we go out into the world, and I mean it's a funny experiment, but it also can be very sweet in the right context, which is imagine that you are the last unawakened being in the world. Everybody else is awake and everything else is awake, and you're already in a Pure Land. And so whatever is happening, the assumption is every awake being here is trying to get me to wake up. So what is the Dhamma? What are these beings, all these bodhisattvas everywhere? And like, I know it's a stretch sometimes to think about our political leaders as bodhisattvas. I'm saying it's a thought experiment. It's a way of perceiving reality. If they were trying to help me wake up by doing whatever they're doing right now, what would that be? What are they trying to get me to cultivate or to let go of? how are they trying to get me to practice right effort? And so I do think that non-preference is a useful lens, but I think for me, maybe because of the language, it has more to do with recognizing the sheer, and this is the distress tolerance, and it's also the willingness to grieve, is just the sheer magnitude of what I don't control. And then if I walk around the world with a recognition of like, okay, I can control the degree, like how I meet this, but I can't control the this. And then come at it either from the Pure Land perspective or, well, yeah, I do like that. I like coming from the place of like, what does this want me to understand? What is this inviting me? So my business is called Inviting the Conversation. Like, what is this inviting me to be in conversation with? So yes, I think non-preference is another way to get there for people. I think sometimes in certain communities, I've seen that used to erase people's diversity of experience and even maybe their needs around their own capacity and being tuned to, and sort of getting erased by the dominant culture and be like, just erase yourself and then do what we're all doing. Yeah. And that can get a little wonky at times, but I think that's one way in. Sutta? We're all good for a sutta? All right, let's take a moment though. It's so easy for me to get excited. I was in a 5-hour visioning meeting before I came here, and okay, I'll do that. And we were also playing with a lot of words and ideas and getting excited. So wanting to feel again, this is a nice opportunity to tune into the earth element, to feel the weight of the body, to feel the way the earth is inviting us down into its core. Co-regulating with the earth beneath us. So the sutta that I wanted to look at today is in the Anguttara Nikaya. The Anguttara Nikaya is organized by the number of things in the sutta, which may seem like an interesting way to organize things, but it's convenient if sometimes you are like, wow, we're being thinking about the sutta, and there's this list of 5 ways the Buddha talks about getting free from hatred. Like, did you check the Anguttara 5s? Because they might be in there. So this is indeed a list of 5 that's in the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 5, number 162, but it can show up other ways depending on which Pali canon they're using. But so it's a list of 5 ways. The sutta is the Agha is the hatred, right? There are lots of words for ill will, hatred, anger, just like there are in English. So Agata Pativinaya Sutta. The Pativinaya is often translated as something like subduing. And then Agata here is hatred. And it's interesting because the title is a little bit misleading. It gives you the sense, as is often the case in the suttas, when anger and hatred and ill will come up, there's often this language of like, just like, and you get rid of it as quick as you can, and you wrestle it and you make it go away and you completely extirpate it and uproot it, right? And it gives you this very adversarial sense of how to be with anger, how to work with anger on the path. And what's interesting though is often if you keep reading in the suttas, it's not about how you are vis-a-vis the anger. It's what you do such that the anger or the hatred naturally reside. And in this sutta, so for instance, in the previous sutta, 5.161, you have this list of, there's also a list of 5 ways of subduing hatred, and they are metta, karuna, so this is loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, and then focusing on something else, so just like directing your mind away from whatever the thing is that's causing hatred to arise, and kamma, right? This is the causal nature of actions in the mind and the body, that there's this chain of intention, action, and consequence, right? In this sutta, the whole sutta is about relating to the goodness of others. It's not about how you hate hatred or get rid of it. It's about how hatred naturally subsides when you direct the mind toward goodness. So I just want to I just think the title of the sutta can be a little bit misleading in that sense, because it's not like, how do we hate our hatred? It's like there's enough of that already, right? It's like, how do we feel ashamed of our shame? There's enough of that going around. Let's see, what should be said? Yeah, I guess I wanted to bring in a couple of other sort of like famous little places, little nooks. I think in this Sangha, some of the material that goes out uses the Dhammapada, the fifth verse of the Dhammapada, which is probably the most famous. It's a different word for hatred, that's Vera, Vera. But it's Nahi Varena Virani Samanti Tha Kudachanam Avarena Chasamanti Isa Dhammo Sanantano. It is not by hatred that hatred ever ceases. It is by, and this is what's interesting, because it gets translated like love or loving kindness. The word is avarena. So it's vera for hatred, and then it's avera. So non-hatred would be a literal translation. In Pali, you can do both. You can translate it as not that, or you can translate it as the opposite of the thing. The reason I don't like to do that is because, as we'll see in the sutta and from what I just said, when you leave it as non-hatred, you actually open, instead of saying, well, love is the antidote to hatred, you actually open to a whole spectrum of skillful means, including love, right? But also including contemplation of goodness, also including equanimity, also including looking away, also including these other contemplations, right? So what I like about, I think part of the reason that the Buddha leaves so much space, and sometimes to people's frustration, like, just tell me what to do, just tell me how to fix the problem. Instead, there's an acknowledgement implicitly that what may be right for your life experience in this context, vis-a-vis that person or that situation, might actually be different. You might have to be sensitive to context and have a variety of tools in your toolkit to be able to soften around hatred and anger in this particular context, right? So it's, yeah, hatred never ceases by hatred, but by non-hatred, by loving kindness, by all these skillful means that soften hatred. This is how it ceases. Esa Dhammo Sanantano. This is an unending truth. This is an eternal law, right? That hatred never ceases by way of hatred. Just one of the reasons I wanted to make sure that with the title, I was saying we're not in the market here to go to war with our own hatred, right? The second has to do with, no, it is. So one of the most moving, and I'll probably cry at a couple points during this, so we'll see how that goes, but we'll hold space for that. I feel very tender around it. But one of the things I sometimes find the Buddha speaking about his own experience after he's awakened, like, it's a little sometimes so far removed from my experience. I'm like, I can't actually connect with what you're describing all that much. But sometimes there are these really wonderful moments where the Buddha is describing his experience before he was awakened. And he's talking about his own fear and disorientation and what went into him walking on the path. And one of these places is he's saying to the communities, is in the Sutta Nipata, which is all in verse. That's a very different kind of text, but in the Tipitaka. Sorry, in the sutta part of the canon, it's just in the verse section, the Khuddaka Nikaya. He says, I will tell you about my dismay. I will tell you about what frightened me into practicing and what cultivated Samvega, the sense of spiritual urgency. And he says that one day he looked around and he saw people like fish in a puddle. Then the puddle, like imagine a puddle losing water, right? It's hot, and the fish somehow got from the pond into the puddle, and they're losing water, and there's a desperate sense of competition for the water space that's left. And he says he was looking around at how people were in relationship with each other, in competition with each other, violent with each other. And he just became terrified. He said, I found no sanctuary for myself. There was nothing outside of that puddle, as far as I could see, in the human situation, in this samsara. And he says, and this is interestingly also, and I never noticed this until I was writing notes for this, but this is the same thing Ananda says when he's grieving the death of the Buddha and the death of Sariputta. He says, the directions were knocked out of alignment. This is clearly like an idiom for experiencing grief in ancient India. And I use it with my clients all the time, but this idea of losing a sort of central navigatory star or instrument and feeling disoriented and out to sea, right? And so this is the Buddha talking about, and I wanted to bring this verse in because he's describing a way of seeing the world that I find very accessible to me right now when I look around at America. When I look around at, like Valerie works in accessibility, and she shared with our Sangha earlier this week that one of the words that's being flagged as a sort of DEI alert word on websites is belonging. And what happens to a culture that, so Elon Musk a couple days ago, it was sort of published in CNN, and I think it was an older tweet where he said the problem with the West was empathy, or the problem with democracy is that it was tied with empathy, and that empathy was the weakness of the West. I mean, like, I don't use these words lightly when I think about actually having true sociopaths and psychopaths sort of like in charge of like steering the ship right now. And that's where I notice my own sort of hatred and anger coming up, is that, oh, all of the normal tools that we would use to inspire and guide our politicians with a sense of empathy and shame and negotiation and sort of any sort of reasonability of like, hey, people are going to get hurt. They don't land anywhere when you believe that empathy is a human weakness, right? They don't land anywhere when you genuinely, authentically don't care about the well-being of others. And so that's very frightening to me, because it's like, oh, all the skills that I learned in conflict resolution, like mediation, like how to appeal to the heart. It's like, oh, those don't have anywhere to land in these particular cases. And then I find myself getting really enraged because I feel so helpless, right? And so, but I bring all that up because that imagery of looking out and seeing something that sometimes the metaphor is a desert, as we'll see. Sometimes it's a puddle that can't sustain that number of beings and fish. And so there's competition and fighting and terror. It can be a variety of different ways, but the Buddha actually uses that in this sutta that we're going to go into. Oops. To, I think, validate the experience of being caught in what Francis Weller calls the long dark, right? These experiences in the human realm of really not feeling particularly safe and knowing that we're moving into something. I don't, the word unprecedented is so, it's not unprecedented, truthfully, because human society moves in these cycles, but there's something we're on the cusp of that I think we're being, it's easy to be told that you're overreacting or you're crazy, and like, we're watching a real deconstruction, dismantling of many of the things that we've been insulated by our privilege not to experience, at least I think many of the people in the space, right? So I say that because as we go through, I want to just, have a little bit of a building block there. And so this sutta is 5 beings. Is there anything else in that? Yeah, wanting to have a haven and not finding it. So in this sutta, the Buddha says, actually, the contemplation of the goodness of others is the sanctuary we build for ourselves in the world. And so we have 5 categories of beings, and don't worry about trying to keep them straight. A being who has impure bodily conduct and pure verbal conduct, right? So this is often the way that kamma is divided. There's verbal kamma, there's bodily kamma, and then there's mental kamma. So there's intentional action of the body, speech, and mind. And all of these have consequence. So the Buddha will often subdivide things in this way. So pure or wholesome verbal kamma and unwholesome bodily kamma. So wholesome bodily kamma and unwholesome verbal kamma. Unwholesome verbal kamma and unwholesome bodily kamma, but sometimes experiences moments of mental clarity. Unskillful verbal kamma, unskillful bodily kamma, and does not experience moments of clarity. And then somebody, and I love that he includes this one, somebody who has wholesome verbal conduct, wholesome bodily conduct, and experiences moments of mental clarity. It's like, oh, right, we can also hate people that are awesome and highly developed, that our hatred is not actually limited to beings who just, that the beings who piss us off, it's not actually that they're always bad or something's wrong with them, right? Wrong with them. Actually, we can just be jealous and angry at somebody who embodies something that we wish we did. You know, we're coming from a place of scarcity or getting hijacked. So the Buddha gives
Sorry, can I clarify? This is about
the other being.
the other being, okay.
Yeah, okay. This is good because what else would it have been?
Myself.
Myself. I think it could apply in any particular moment in that direction, but this is being with beings who are manifesting in this way, or who this is kind of their constitution as they stand. So the Buddha says that hatred for all these five should be in the word again, Bhakti Vinaya. Again, Vinaya, right? Same Vinaya is like the rules for monks and nuns, so the restraint. And so to restrain against it, to subdue, but let's see what happens here, because again, it's about directing the mind. And if any of you are familiar with Majjhima Nikaya, so the middle length discourse is number 20, the Buddha gives 5 strategies for dealing with like invasive or habitual, obnoxious thoughts that just won't stop seizing the mind. And the first one of those arguably is what he's pointing out throughout the sutta. The first one, he says, the metaphor is, as a carpenter would knock out a coarse peg with a fine one. So it's thought replacement, right? So instead of focusing on the very things, this is also Dhammapada verses 3 and 4. Instead of focusing on the things that we hate and cycling, you hit me, you robbed me, you're, like I'm your victim. Instead of that, moving the mind somewhere else. I do think it's important to qualify here and say, this is not an invitation to pretend as though our hurt is invalid, to not acknowledge when somebody has been violent or who has been abusive. This is not about becoming a doormat, right? There are plenty of places where the Buddha talks about the consequences of unskillful actions. He holds people accountable. He puts a new rule in the Vinaya. There's all sorts of ways that this comes up. I want to just be very clear, and this is the danger with any particular sutta, it's not the whole of the Dhamma, right? It's a tool that may be useful in particular contexts, right? So we need to be sensitive to that. And one of the risks having the whole of the Pali Canon available to us 2,600 years later is that we're reading all these suttas, many of which don't have a lot of context. And we're thinking that we're supposed to be in line with all of them at any given time, but the Buddha was usually asked a question. He was responding to a being in a time, in a place, in a situation, in a caste, and all the rest of it, and giving them advice that fit their karma and their particular context, right? So let's start with, I actually think is a little paradoxical, but let's start with its pure verbal conduct, impure bodily conduct, which, so I mean, think about it. Somebody who is unskillful, right? Somebody who does unskillful actions with their body. Actually, no, I can think of, I spent some time thinking about some of these with other beings, but like somebody who acts unskillfully with their body, and you can think about this maybe like somebody who's really caught in an addiction, right? Somebody who's just, they keep using their body for either harm internally or externally, and they're just caught in a cycle, right? But they're honest. They're not manipulative or lying. They're not doing it out of malice, like, but maybe they're still like, no, I really do need help, and I really do feel connected to you. I just can't. I'm just caught in this bodily cycle, right? And so the Buddha says this is like, this is great because this tells you something about India. If you don't know, monks' robes at the time were made out of discarded rags. So they would wander around, find rags in trash heaps, and then they would cut away or tear off the useful part that was unsoiled, and they would leave the soiled part on the trash heap, and then they would sew these together and make themselves a robe eventually. It was like very challenging and time consuming, right? So the Buddha says, this is like finding a rag, finding a piece of cloth that is soiled in one part and pure in the other. And he says, you take your feet and you hold the soiled part with your left foot and you tear the the pure part off with your right foot, and you pick it up and you take away the pure part and you leave the other, right? So that pure piece of cloth is their verbal conduct, right? Like, I'll take what's useful. I'll be like, wow, maybe you have beautiful, eloquent words, despite like, oof, whatever else you got going on. I don't want to be around it, but like, wow, beautiful. Like maybe they write poetry. Maybe they are just very honest, even though what they're honest about is kind of sketchy and scary. And just as like, I'll take that piece of cloth away. You're also getting a sense of why in certain Buddhist traditions and Indic traditions broadly, you don't point your feet toward the teachers, right? Because they were usually covered in not nice things, because you were walking around in trash heaps and dung piles and tearing pieces of cloth off with your feet.
Does this connect to the peg idea where it's like you're tearing?
The peg idea is more generally for this sutta about the thought of I hate you because, like, I'm going to focus on like, and your bodily behavior is just such trash, right? I'm just rolling in all the things that you've done that are hurtful, and instead knocking that out with the peg of I'm going to take a moment to focus on this one piece of your cloth that is pure and lovely, and that I can sew into my robe. I can use it to actually protect myself. Because he's using that, I mean, that metaphor really would have a special context for monks and nuns, right? Not only am I taking it with me, I'm sewing it into my robe that will keep me safe from mosquitoes and heat and cold, right? So it's more just a general sense of like thought replacement or shifting what the mind is focused on. Does that make sense? Okay. The next metaphor. So now we have a being who has impure verbal conduct, right? So maybe this is a liar. Maybe it's somebody who speaks very harshly. Maybe it's somebody who gossips. But actually, when it comes to their bodily conduct and how they comport themselves in the world, they are caring and honest, and they take care of, honest, again, not so much in speech. Like imagine somebody whose profession requires that they lie, or at least they benefit from if they lie, right? So think about people in finance or people in the law or people, whatever it is, you bend the truth and you make an art out of bending the truth to some degree. And what if, though, you do find that their actions, they live by the precepts otherwise, and they do things of service in the world, right? The Buddha says that this is like, and this is where I'm going to read it because I think the language is really telling, and this is why I read you the piece from the Sutta Nipata. And as for a person who is impure in their verbal behavior, but pure in their bodily behavior, how should one subdue hatred for them? There is the case where a pool overgrown with slime and water plants, and a person comes along burning with heat, covered with sweat, exhausted, trembling, thirsty. They would jump into the pool, part the slime with water and plants with both hands, and then cupping their hands, drink the water and go on their way. In the same way, when an individual is impure in verbal behavior and pure in bodily behavior, it goes back to the beginning. So what I wanted to point out was the Buddha is painting a picture, and I feel torn about this, but I can hold the paradox that the Dalai Lama has made the case in the past that the news is profoundly misleading, that actually, though it is easy to focus on what's like the big things that are going very wrong in the world, for every one big thing that's going wrong, there are countless acts of kindness happening moment to moment, day by day. I think this is true, and I think it can sound in contradiction with, but I don't think it is, the fact that actually dukkha is ubiquitous, that stress and fear, and not only that, but the fact that human beings, we are evolutionarily conditioned to have a negativity bias, to actually have the mind be directed toward things that are wrong and hurt and painful. And so samsara is a puddle that is full of greed, hatred, and delusion, right? And I think we can acknowledge and actually wonder at how amazing it is that people are sometimes so good to each other, despite the fact that the baseline unconscious conditioning is often greed, aversion, and delusion, right? So the way that the Buddha seems to be speaking to this and cultivating that same sense of samvega or spiritual urgency or dismay at being caught in samsara is he's saying walking around in this world, walking around in America at this moment, governed by the cruel and the indifferent, that this is like wandering through a desert, pressed by heat, covered in sweat, exhausted. And so he's painting a picture. What is your state before you get to the pool, right? What's your just wandering baseline state through this realm? And he says, so then when you come to a being, instead of going, ick, slime and plants, I'm not touching that. It's like, you are desperate at this point, guys. Jump in, part the slime, and drink, right? And so I think that like that baseline experience of the slime, of course, you know, here the slime and the plants are the verbal behavior. He's saying get past the verbal behavior and dive into their wholesome bodily behavior, which is telling also because he's making something of a hierarchy there of the verbal being the sort of superficial layer on top and then going into the way this person embodies goodness. And so not just part and dive in, but like nourish yourself again. Protect yourself with the robe, with the rag, you know, of the verbal goodness. Nourish yourself from the goodness of their bodily behavior. This is the heart metaphor. This next one is the heart metaphor of the sutta, though, the one that sticks to mind. That whenever I think like, oh, I'm doing a good job, it's like, no, you got some work to do. And this is when somebody has unskillful verbal behavior, unskillful bodily behavior, and every once in a while experiences moments of clarity in the mind. And the Buddha says, again, you are covered in sweat, hot, exhausted, oppressed by heat. And imagine that in this state, you come across a cow's footprint in the mud. And that cow's footprint in the mud is the only water around. It's caught rain, and this is the only place where it hasn't yet evaporated. And he says, knowing that if you were to take a cup or your hands to try and scoop the water up, you would make it undrinkable. You would make it, what does he say? Covered with sweat. If I tried to drink the water using my hand or cup, I would disturb it, stir it up, and make it unfit to drink. He says, so because you can't do that, what do? And this always gets me. You get down on your hands and knees, and you put your lips to it, and you drink, because that's the only way you can get there. It's the only way you can get the water, is to get so humble down in the mud on your hands and knees, and you drink up those little moments of clarity. And this was a place where I wanted to stop and ask, because I find it I like assuming that the Buddha used the pieces of the metaphor he did and that they all have a reason for being there. So I wanted to ask, like, what do you think it is that the cup or your hand is? Like, why would he include that piece? Like, what happens if we think about interacting with somebody who has just that little bit of goodness available? What could we do that would make that undrinkable, right? And so I won't do it because we have like literally 11 minutes. But I did ask, can I share anything? So I asked both my partner and then a friend and kind of mentor that teaches at Spirit Rock, like, what do you make of that? And so Amanda talked about the idea of surrendering my preferences and my need for you to fit into my terms, but like getting so radically humble, acknowledging like, I have to accept this being and all the ways that they show up in the world that I cannot understand on their own terms, to really be that humble, to not try to control the way that their goodness shows up in the world. Try to just do justice to, okay. And Sean said, you know, that he actually took it to part, like, I have to be really careful how I engage with this person. And actually, I might avoid them the vast majority of the time. It might be like somebody I work with that I have to run into, like, I have a meeting once a month with, right? Like, I'm not going to seek them out other than that one meeting. How do I want to show up in that one meeting, right? How do I want to engage with that little bit of goodness where I see them resting in a moment of clarity or taking a deep breath, whatever it is, and like, oh yeah, I can relate to what it's like to settle for just a moment. And so, yeah, that radical sense of humility, and that humility born of being desperate for nourishment. And there's a whole thread here that I won't go into that often gets neglected, that really only Thich Nhat Hanh, in my experience, speaks about regularly, which is the idea of nutriment in the Buddha's teachings, which ties back into tanha and upadana and the way that we thirst and feed on life. Because that's what craving and clinging actually translates to, is thirsting and feeding. And so this whole idea of feeding, thirsting, nutriment, nourishing, watering seeds, there's a lot of imagery that's consistent across the suttas that because we translate into English, we actually miss out on. But so far we have the rag that we tear, the pool that we jump into and part the muck and then drink. We have the cow's footprint that we're just getting down on our hands and knees and saying we're so desperate for some water in the desert. We're so desperate for goodness that we're willing to get down into that humiliating position just to say, okay, I need this, otherwise I'm going to die. I'm going to die without the goodness of others, right? And then we have, and I'm going to read this one too, and then we have somebody who ain't got nothing going for him, right? So unskillful bodily behavior, unskillful verbal behavior, they don't even have moments of mental clarity. I can think of a couple of people that fit this bill. And he says, just as when there is a sick person, sorry, I usually edit in real time. Just as when there is a sick person in pain, seriously ill, traveling along a road, far from the next village and far from the last, unable to get the food they need, unable to get the medicine they need, unable to get a suitable helper, unable to get anyone to take them to human habitation. I mean, like just to take a moment to imagine like being, when you've been really sick, but imagine you're not in bed and really sick. Imagine you're in the street and there's no village that you can see behind you, and there's no village you can see ahead of you. And you're just weak and sick and disoriented, and you're not sure you're going to make it. Now suppose that another person were to see them coming along the road. They would do, out of compassion, pity, and sympathy for the person, thinking, oh, that this person should get the food they need, the medicine they need, a suitable helper, someone to take them to human habitation. Why is that? So they won't fall into ruin right here. In the same way, when a person is impure in those three ways, one should do what they can out of compassion, pity, and sympathy for them, thinking, oh, that this person should abandon wrong bodily conduct, wrong verbal conduct, wrong mental conduct. Why is that? So that after death, at the breakup of the body, that they won't end up in a plane of deprivation in a bad destination in the lower realms. So this is tricky, and we could have done a whole session just on this, because this is why I really balk at teachers who sort of refuse to include Kamma in the multi-life model. I'm not saying we all have to be religious about it. I'm not saying we should blindly believe it. I'm not pitching that. But there is a radically different way of experiencing a situation like the one the Buddha is describing if we hold space for the multi-life model and for the reality of Kamma beyond what we can see and experience in this life. And even not in this life, just like birth and death, but like in the life that is like opening in this moment. And part of that is like, if you really think about somebody, so there's a place in the suttas where the Buddha talks about 4 kinds of people. He says, there's a person running from darkness to darkness, darkness to light, light to darkness, and light to light. And so he says, you know, for instance, somebody like Donald Trump is a person running from light to darkness. This is somebody who has come into this world with in some exceptional karma from some past place, right? And I'm saying again, entertain this possibility. These material needs met, like this man has never had to deal with any sort of meaningful trial or tribulation or major non-relational trauma in his life. I mean, he's been insulated from what 98% of the population of this country have had to deal with at some point or another. And so the ability to empathize and understand is really sort of a distant phenomenon. And this is a man who is so clearly running toward and has been running toward darkness for the entirety of his adult life. And it's one thing to look at this and say, because if we come from a scientific materialist model, it's like, I just don't see any consequences happening here. And we can rationalize and be like, in this moment, and I do believe this, but like in this moment, to experience the kind of suffering and aloneness and disconnection that would be implicit on being a sociopath of that sort of status and being that disconnected from the average human experience. I think we could say like, oh, there is suffering in that. But the Buddha here is talking about something much broader. And when you think about somebody running from light to darkness, if you think about whatever village they were coming from and whatever village they're going to, we're talking about a desert in between, and the consequences of the consistency of harming. Like if I just for a moment zoom out and I think about the sheer number of beings that have suffered by his decisions and words and actions and hands, it's mind-blowing to me to think about what the, like I want to cry when I think about the consequence of that much harm, right? And if you believe that it's like, well, we just do what we do and then you die and then there's nothing, that creates a certain image. And if you think, oh, this is lifetime number 733,421 out of another like a couple billion, and it's like these are just the seeds that are being sown for that consciousness in this life and whatever it's going to feed on to go. Like that's a real different feel for what that consciousness is going to have to contend with moving forward. And when the Buddha talks about having compassion for that, when I think about, oh, Donald, like the seeds you were planting for yourself, oh, you have no idea what you're in for. Like, and I don't feel in that moment, I don't feel any like schadenfreude of like, oh, he's gonna get, I just think like the sheer magnitude is beyond comprehension. And so that's, yeah, there's a whole thing about karma there that I won't go into. The last one will be unsurprising to you, where the Buddha says, if you're experiencing hatred for somebody who's got beautiful bodily conduct, beautiful verbal conduct, and experiences mental clarity, then what you do is you jump into that beautiful clear pool and you drink and you celebrate how amazing it is to have that available to yourself. You know, he's you know, really, he's like having plunged into that pool and bathed and drunk. Oh, that's what he includes, this little detail. Is when there is a pool of clear water, sweet, cool, limpid, with gently sloping banks. I love that, just that detail. Gently sloping banks, shaded on all sides by many kinds of trees, right? You have the perfect oasis here. And so, and then again, he says, covered in heat, sweating, exhausted, trembling, thirsty, right? Plunge into the pool, bathe, drunk, lie down under a tree. That's what he says you should do when you come across a being like this. Whatever your stuff is that's coming up, just put that to the side and just wonder at how amazing it is that there's basically a Buddha standing in front of you. You don't need to be jealous because you're not in competition. Just dive into them and then rest in the shade of their wisdom, right? And so he says, these are the 5 ways of subduing hatred. There's so much more we could go into. I would like to hear all kinds of ways of what analogies stuck with you and didn't. I would like to spend a lot more time on Kamma and the multi-life model, but I'm going to let that go because last time we went a half an hour over and I don't want to have that be a precedent. Yeah, that's it, I think, for now. If there are any questions, I'm happy to stay a few minutes after. But if you have to go, I also want to respect your time.
Thank you, Asha. I just want to say I put in the chat the information for those of you who feel moved to practice Dana and make a donation to Asher. His PayPal, Venmo, Zelle information is in the chat. And also here, there's a QR code in the back on that table for our teacher. And then also, if you'd like to make a donation to Pacific Northwest Meditation, there's also a QR code there as well. And in the chat, we operate solely on donations. So the rent of this room, the Dana to our teacher, everything is through your contribution. So this is, you know, the community here exists, the Sangha exists through your support and your generosity. So I just want to thank you all for your presence too, because it's your presence that makes this Sangha possible, and your listening and your shares, and just so delighted and so filled with joy. You ended on that note, and that just made me smile so much because it was feeling really heavy. I'll be honest. I was like, this is intense. So thank you. It was such a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And if anyone like to stay to chat with Asher. We can continue in a very casual way. And those of you who have to go, feel, welcome to leave, depart, and come back whenever you can. We're here every Saturday. And if you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll get more details on there about who's teaching, what topic, and then also all the other offerings and our affinity groups that are meeting. One is this Sunday, Be Queer Now meets this Sunday, and then on Tuesday, this Tuesday, Neurosangha also meets. So you'll find that on the website. And yeah, and so and then we also have snacks and such. So for those of you who stay after chatting and conversing with Asher, I'd like to invite you down to the cafeteria and we'll have some snacks and tea and whatnot. Okay, if you feel moved to. And yeah, and I'll keep the Zoom on for those on Zoom who'd like to continue. Okay. I think I'll go ahead and pause the recording here so then everything else could be off the record.